Like the program that we had on Africa in World War II not too long ago, this Botanical History of World War II is one of those presentations we love to bring you because it's a perspective that's, unique. You don't get to hear things like this. So we love to offer that as programs here. Judith is a botanist and she's an author. She says that she's been interested in plants from her early childhood. She grew up about 8 miles outside of Boston, or was it still in Boston? Where you grew up? Outside Boston. And she said there were still farms around then. Can you imagine that? And she used to visit them, and she learned as a child all of the names of the wildflowers and the shrubs and the trees. I can't do that. I always just say that blue flower or that, terrible. In college, her graduate work centered on a family of flowering plants in the Pacific region, and that certainly encouraged her interest in eventually doing this history of the Pacific region about biology and plants during World War II. So again, there'll be a question and answer period at the end. Judith also has her book over here that she'd be happy to sign for you after the program if you'd like to purchase one. So please welcome Judith Sumner.
Thank you for that generous introduction. Can you hear me? I'm not quite as tall as he is. How about that? Good.
Yes.
So it is a pleasure to speak to you tonight. And to start with, I want to tell you a little bit about the origins of this project. Richard Evans Schultes, who is widely regarded as the father of modern ethnobotany, he was a professor of botany at Harvard University, often commented that history should be written by botanists. Now, perhaps this is presumptuous, but much history does involve plants, whether landscape, natural products, agriculture, foodways, famine, shortages. There are many reasons to make room for botanical perspectives in understanding the past. I intersected personally with several aspects of World War II botany over the years. My father joined the 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company when they were in New Jersey, and then found out rather quickly that they were shipping en masse to Schofield Barracks on the island of Oahu. His widowed mother was not pleased. But once on Oahu, he studied a number of botanical products, including fibers, various operational rations, including chicle, quinine, cotton, and canvas. All the sort of work that an Army chemist had to do. His widowed mother, left in New York City, talked about the neighbors' victory gardens that supplied her with vegetables. My grandfather, who was a career Army officer, talked about placing prisoners of war with American farm families. And many of these POWs from Germany much preferred to farm in the U.S. during the war years and spend several more years as a foot soldier with the Wehrmacht. By the time I was a graduate student, I was working on the floor of the Fiji Islands, and I stumbled across numerous anecdotes about the effect of the war on the Pacific Islands and about survival in the Pacific Islands. And I realized that in particular, how much the Fijian Islands had been taken over by kudzu, the scourge of the American South, which was introduced to the Pacific as a camouflage plant and now covers many Pacific islands. It's an absolute catastrophe. Well, at any rate, several years ago, I decided to task myself with the investigation of plant uses and applications during the Second World War. Each and every plant connection that I could identify and document. I have to tell you, my husband, Steve Sumner, was a big help in this undertaking. He is here tonight. He is seated in the extreme back right of the room. And if you have an obscure question about an obscure aspect of World War II, please do not ask me. But you could ask him. If you have a question about a plant-related question in World War II, that I can probably answer, or at least say something that you might believe. Now, so anyway, going into this project, I was extremely naive, and I must say I thought that this would involve probably victory gardens, a little bit about agriculture, maybe a little bit about medicinal plants, who knows, maybe a tree or two, a little bit about rubber, maybe a little bit about camouflage, and we would call it a day. And I discovered that it was a much broader topic than I had suspected going into it. And today, we're going to sort of hop and skip around, and this is just sort of the tip of the iceberg between those two covers. Today, we're going to sort of hop, skip, jump around. We're going to talk about victory gardens, talk a little bit about agriculture, talk a little bit about medicinal plants, timber, I want to say something about cotton and hemp, close out with a little bit about camouflage. So, we'll start at the beginning here, and most Americans became aware of the beginnings of World War II with the enactment of the Lend-Lease. And even before we had declared war on Japan and Germany, we were sending food abroad, particularly to England. And much of it was agricultural products from big American farms. At this point, 2 years before we were even involved in the war, Eleanor Roosevelt could read the tea leaves. She knew where all this was heading. And she wanted to start a victory garden at the White House. Claude Wickert, who was the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, did not want to do this. And he was fully aware that at the Woodrow Wilson White House, they did raise vegetables and they raised sheep, but he wasn't about to do it. Of course, many people during the Depression grew vegetable gardens, and many of them were ready just to continue. You can see that inset in the lower right there that actually says victory, and that was a subsistence garden that dated from the Depression, which now had been turned into a little victory garden. But this was all more or less being done informally without the approval or the support of the USDA. But then, after Pearl Harbor, finally Claude Wickert at the U.S. Department of Agriculture agreed that it was time to start a formal victory garden program. Eleanor got her victory garden at the White House. The large picture there shows Diana Hopkins. She's the daughter of presidential advisor Harry Hopkins. He was one of the many people who lived with the Roosevelts in the White House. And that is Eleanor's victory garden. I don't think Eleanor really got out there and did much tilling and hoeing herself, but she was behind it. She talked about it. She promoted it. And the inset in the lower right is Horticultural Hall in Boston. That might be the closest she got to a victory garden here in New England, as she went to Horticultural Hall both in 43 and 44 to judge the big displays of victory garden produce that were mounted by the Mass Horticultural Society. And then Americans began to see a large number of posters promoting victory gardening. And you can see the one on the left is one of the earliest. It says war gardens. And war gardens were, of course, the term for these gardens during World War I, and then that was replaced by victory gardens. But notice grow vitamins at your kitchen door. We'll talk more about vitamins later, but vitamins were really considered a critical part of the war. They were a relatively new scientific discovery, and there was concern there would be vitamin shortages. There were concerns that maybe the Germans would try to deprive us of vitamins and cause mental illness among Americans. And so this was also seen not only as a source of food, but also as a source of vitamins. And of course, all of this was unfolding in the spring of 1942, our first spring of war. And at the same time, the rationing program came to light. And the idea of rationing was one of equal access to high-demand foods and goods. The first foods that were rationed were botanical foods, coffee and sugar. Meats, of course, were also rationed, many canned goods. Any vegetable that an 18 to 30-year-old young man would like were rationed. So corn was rationed. Spinach, oddly, was not. And so housewives doing their shopping all of a sudden were looking to fill in their meals with homegrown vegetables to replace certain canned goods and crops that they could not obtain at the shops any longer. And the poster on the right, you can see this is a little bit of a morality tale here. Without rationing, the wealthy matron at the top would be walking off with everything in short supply, and the young matron to the right would would be desperate. And with rationing, everybody had to produce the stamps and the ration book and had equal access to everything. That doesn't mean that there wasn't a black market, but it did try to keep most trade, especially for food, above board and fair. And there was a vast number of different publications about victory gardening that came out during the war. There was no one nationwide guide because the U.S. encompasses many different climatic zones. And so these were regional in nature, and many of them were published by county extension offices at universities, at the land-grant schools. Over on the right, that's from the New York Botanical Garden. The one in the middle is sort of a generic one that was published in the Middle Atlantic states, and local propane companies, hardware stores would get copies of this, put their name on it, and give it out to their customers. All of the seed catalogs adapted to victory gardening. Notice over on the left, Gardens for Defense, the Holland American Seed Company. Now, just a year before, that would have been all flowers, beautiful flowers, but once the war was on, now it's growing vegetables. And Holland America, well, this is an interesting point. Many of the seeds that were used to grow vegetables in this country actually were imported from Holland. And once the Germans had invaded Holland, they stopped exporting seeds to Allied countries. And so there actually was a garden seed shortage in the U.S. at the beginning of the war. And what this meant was that at the USDA, our friend Claude Rickert was really opposed to having Americans grow anything in the way of a small garden. He thought that urban gardeners could not possibly produce, and he was afraid seeds would be wasted. Of course, the Americans proved him wrong on that point. And, traditionally, if we're planting, we will often, drop 3 seeds in the pot and thin down to the best seedling that comes up. No, during the war, you planted 1 seed and you took care of it because there just wasn't enough seed to allow two little seedlings to be snipped off. Burpee's seed catalog over there on the right, this is the last one of the war years. It was a controversial cover. They couldn't quite decide if they ought to publish it. They thought maybe it was a little too graphic. You see V for victory outlined by the pigmented petioles of the Swiss chard. Notice the torpedoes coming down. We call them carrots. They're in the upper left. And we have bombs. We call them tomatoes coming down there as well. And they debated long and hard about whether they would publish them. This is Life magazine, March 30th, 1942. Came out just before most people would have started growing and tilling their first year of victory gardens. Look who's on the cover. That's a slightly grown-up Shirley Temple. And this was one of a few different multi-page articles in Life magazine that encouraged people with victory gardening. It was a serious matter, but Life magazine decided to make more or less a friendly and light story of it. And so they did cartoons, basically showing you what to do and what not to do. So don't try to just knock down the trees in the forest and broadcast seed. That will not work. Prepare the soil. Don't plant on the incline. Make sure you water. Don't let the soil get parched. All the traditional do's and don't do's of gardening. And one thing I do want to mention is that victory gardens were by no means organic gardens. That is an advertisement from a newspaper in Providence, Rhode Island, over there on the left. And if you can read the fine print, I'll just mention to you some of what is in there. They're advertising strychnine, creosote, various fumigants, arsenate compounds, basically poison anything that is trying to eat or infest your crops, because the idea was productivity. And not only that, none of this little French vegetable business with victory gardens. The crops were grown on until they were truly mature to maximum productivity. People here in New England increased the length of the growing season by using hotbeds, and you can see that in the upper right. A hotbed could be made from old window sash, and you made a little wooden box, you installed the window sash on top, excavated out under it, and filled that pit with manure. And manure is teeming with bacteria. Bacteria are carrying on metabolism. Same way we're metabolizing, we're warm, those bacteria are warm, and they actually would heat that up and make a little passive greenhouse. And so people here in New England could start growing lettuce in February. And they could grow crops late in the season into November and maybe even early December. And so these were techniques that were used just to allow a little bit more latitude on the availability of crops rather than a big flush at the end of the summer. I want to mention a few of the plants that were grown in Victory Gardens. And the emphasis here was on productivity. And these, of course, today would all be in an heirloom seed catalog. None of these were hybrids. They were all open pollinated. And upper left there, Copenhagen cabbage, and those would be grown until they were bigger than a man's head. Hubbard squash in the lower right, and squash were particular favorites because they did not have to be canned or frozen or dried. You could just take a squash and throw it in an unheated bedroom. There was even one they advertised that was called the 7-year squash. I don't know if anyone kept it 7 years, but anyway, that's what it was called. Globe radish, those were considered rather nice for salads, and various sorts of onions. Onions were particularly important because many of the dishes that would be cooked, prepared, and that were in the wartime cookbooks were basically vegetable casseroles, and they could be pretty lacking in flavor without an onion. Upper left, green leafy vegetables, various sorts of lettuces. That is a tennis ball lettuce. Most of the booklets about Victory Gardens, most of the bulletins, encourage people to grow short, stubby carrots so that if you had the carrot hit a rock, they didn't split and become 2 tap roots. Legumes over on the lower right, any sort of pea or bean, those are telephone pole peas, but any sort of pea or bean was a substitute for meat because of the high nitrogen content. And then melons. So that's the sun and stars melon there in the lower right. Melons were a little bit of a controversy. People liked them. They were almost like a dessert. But the USDA didn't think they had much in the way of nutritional content. We now know that that isn't true. Watermelons were scorned, and other melons were sort of reluctantly were grown and encouraged with some degree of reluctance. City gardens were a big part of Victory Gardening. The original idea, of course, was scorned by the Department of Agriculture. Wickard at the USDA thought a minimum garden size should be 25 feet by 50 feet. Many people in the city do not have 25 feet by 50 feet. But that was the minimum approved size. But it turns out that in a small little area of the city, even just a little tract of land between buildings, you can see there with a skyscraper in the background, a horse tilling the soil in Boston. Upper right, that's the Schwab estate in New York City. That was broken up into plots. Most city gardens, tennis courts, and lawns were divided up into little plots and gardens that people could grow. The big issue in the cities is that the soil was often filled with debris, rocks, shards of glass, chunks of old boilers, piping, bricks, all this stuff. And so the soil had to be sorted through, sifted, and have a lot of this stuff removed before people could safely garden. A little bit about Boston. In Boston, this is typical of all cities, so this is just sort of the Boston story, but I think we could repeat this for virtually every American city. There was one person, Henry Wendler, and he was originally a Boston public school teacher, and he eventually took over Victory Gardens for the entire city of Boston. He was the one who organized the big exhibits and the big competitions at Horticultural Hall. He's the one who encouraged gardening in any available plot of land. So up at the upper left, that's actually the lawn in front of the Museum of Fine Arts, which if you visit the MFA today, that is grass. Well, not during the war. It was divided up into plots, and staff could go out and garden at lunchtime. And in the lower right, that's Fenway Gardens. Fenway Gardens was actually started near the MFA, and during the war, it was formalized during the meeting of the Harvard Club, and it's still there. People are still tilling the soil at Fenway Gardens. And many employers, if you were out in the country or out on a road somewhere and you had space around your company, many employers took it upon themselves to go out and prepare the soil and divide it up and encourage people to garden before work, after work, or during lunch. This happens to be a General Electric plant, but this was typical of, I think, most employers who were often actually had some land around the plant. And there was children's gardening as well. And you can see Disney got into the act. And children grew food at school, a rooftop garden, different sorts of competitions. In some states, the teachers even visited children's homes during the summertime and scored the gardens that children were assigned to grow at their houses. I don't think teachers today would do that. But children grew food to take home, but primarily to eat at school as part of their school meal program. And so the bottom line is that by 1944, Americans were growing 44% of the fruits and vegetables they needed for home use. And what this meant also was that people had to learn something about preserving food, because you can have a lot of fresh produce toward the end of the summer and into the early fall, and then nothing for the other 9 or 10 months of the year. And so a big function of the USDA also was to teach and disseminate information about food preservation. And a large part of this was preserving vitamins as well. And I want to say just a little bit about vitamins. Between 1928 and 1943, there were 14 Nobel Prizes awarded for discoveries involving vitamins. Vitamin physiology, isolation, structure, and synthesis, just in approximately 15 years. And so vitamins, during the war, were really a new concept. And what do they really do? Well, they sort of work along with metabolism. And to really repair tissue and do all the bodily functions, you have to have these vitamins. And there was a lot of concern that people have the right vitamins and preserve the right vitamins in their foods. And so almost everything you see about foods during the war says something about vitamins. That little food chart in the middle half there, that was repeated over and over. And foods were all sorted out based on their function. Did they give you energy? Did they help to repair tissue? Did they help you to grow? And the vitamins that actually were in those foods to encourage those metabolic processes. And again, that War Gardens poster from the very beginning of the war, grow vitamins at your kitchen door. Now, the whole shift in cookery during the war was really toward a vegetarian diet. Americans did not become 100% vegetarian, but it used to be that a pound of meat would feed a family. Well, during the war, think in terms of maybe a third to a half a pound of meat would feed a family, with a lot of vegetables mixed in with the meat, so soups and stews and casseroles, to stretch that meat, to sort of spread that meat out among family members, maybe 4 or 5 people eating a half a pound of meat. So all these wartime cookbooks and advertisements and all this sort of thing was aimed towards stretching the available meat with vegetables and also getting vitamins into the diet. For many people, this whole idea of salads from your victory garden, what? You know, people were used to meat and potato and some kind of boiled vegetable, and the whole idea of salad was rather a new idea as well. And then the whole matter of actual canning, because many vegetables, the only thing to do really is to can them. Because not many people had home freezers. So this is the care manual. These are still published. She's wearing her patriotic pinafore there. These are the wartime editions. And talks all about how to actually use a pressure canner to preserve low-acid foods and actually get them canned without the danger of botulism. Of course, the problem during the war was that when you look at that pressure canner, and that's nothing more than a big pressure cooker, basically all the materials in that were critical wartime materials. The metal, the rubber, the gasket, all of this was needed for material. And so the wartime pressure canners that were made were imperfect. There were flaws in the metal, the rubber was bad, the gaskets often fell apart, and they had inaccurate gauges, and there were some terrible explosions. And so women were encouraged to try to use pre-war equipment, pre-war canners, have canning bees if possible, and don't blow yourselves up. Which I think they were dangerous because you had glass in there. The whole purpose of this was to get rid of Clostridium botulinum, and that's that creature you see. It looks like a blue submarine in the lower right. That's a color-enhanced scanning electron microscope image of one botulism bacteria. Notice it's acentric, it's got a swelled end there. That's where the spore lives. And those spores resist virtually everything except a combination of extreme heat and pressure. And so that was the issue, not getting those spores into the canned goods. They produce a nerve toxin, and that's the cause of botulism. And so people in fact did can a sizable amount of food somewhat safely during the war years. And this is what many American families ate during the war, during the winters of the war. Now, I want to segue on to agriculture, because at the same time that people were growing victory gardens at home, big farms were still working to grow food. And what was happening with all of this food? Well, much of it was going to feed the forces all over the world. We were still sending some as Lend-Lease goods, but much of it was going to feed the Army and the Navy. And talk a little bit here about also hybridization. So the whole idea of hybridization, hybridizing crops, was relatively new at the beginning of the war. And the idea of hybridizing is that you take genetically different parents, a parent plant with one desirable characteristic and a parent plant with another desirable characteristic, and you cross them together. So you see those 3 years of corn there on the lower right. The two parents are on the left and right, and then that big robust ear that's bigger than either mom or dad, that's the hybrid offspring. And then you take that and you cross them, you might back cross to one of the parents, if one of those parents has a desirable trait like a long growing season or something like that, and you get this big range of hybrids, and then they would select them on all the sort of genetic reassortment and choose the best lines and keep those going. And so this whole idea of hybridization was something quite new, quite amazing. You can see that farmer up at the top there. To his right is the robust hybrid corn, and then over on his left is the somewhat more puny non-hybrid open pollinated corn. And believe it or not, even though the hybrid corn was much more productive, many farmers didn't like it because the kernels in the ears did not line up properly. And so they would see the crooked little lines and I don't like this, we prefer the straight. But in fact, the hybrid corn was much more productive. And corn was one of the favorite vegetables of the fighting troops. In fact, it was virtually impossible to buy canned corn, although the companies, Green Giant and all the others, continued to advertise and assure the American housewife that soon enough she would be able to buy canned corn and please make do with victory garden crops or canned spinach for the duration. And then you can see that sound breeding work poster up there, just to reassure the American public that hybridization was on the up and up, and a very good thing indeed. And I thought you would be interested just to see where much of this came from. Luther Burbank, and we all know the name Luther Burbank, was an early hybridizer and very practical plant geneticist. And he, of course, did his work during the 20s and 30s and really laid a lot of that groundwork for hybridizing plants. But a little known fact about Luther Burbank was that he, like so many other Americans, was a eugenicist. And just, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but just look at that. If we take a plant we recognize as poisonous, cross it with another that is not poisonous, make the whole plant evil, this is criminal. But suppose we blend together two poisonous plants and make the third even more good. But then, what if we do the same with people, right at the very end there? If we say of two people that have absolutely defined physical impairment who are allowed to marry and bear children. Yeah. And, you know, of course, this sort of thing was eliminated with the demise of the Third Reich, and this sort of thinking was obliterated from American culture and American science, but it was widely taught. It was in the textbooks. And I tell you what, the college I went to, New York State, had an entire building devoted to the teaching of eugenics. It was not being taught when I was a student. But anyway, one other crop that was hybridized extensively during the war was cotton. And if you were to pin me down and say, okay, what is the single most important crop that was grown in the U.S. during the war, I would have to say not food, it would have to be cotton. Because when you think about it, every single tent, many of the robes, much of the cordage, all of the uniforms, all of the underwear, all of this stuff that was needed by these young men and some young women contained cotton. And we depended heavily on cotton production, and hybrid cotton was more productive. Much of the cotton that was grown in this country was actually grown by German farmers who were captured as prisoners of war, who were brought over here and rehomed in the U.S. for the duration of the war. And they lived with American families, many of them in Oklahoma. You can see all those little marks there in Oklahoma, farms with German farmers captured from the Wehrmacht. Happy to be here, let me tell you, growing cotton in the U.S. And some of them actually went back to Germany and then came here and settled after the war. And another, since we're talking fibers here, another important fiber was hemp. And this was a controversial one. That film, Reefer Madness, came out in the 1930s, 36. It's a morality tale. Do not let your children become involved with marijuana. So there was a big debate, should we start growing hemp? Because hemp, in fact, is cannabis sativa. Now, tell you what, there are actually three main groups of cultivars, cultivated types of cannabis sativa. One obviously is grown for the psychotropic properties. These are the drug ones. That's what Reefer Madness was all about. The other lines, genetic lines, one is a fiber, and the other is for a seed oil. Those are the ones that are in canary seeds. That's why often you see the plants growing on the side of the highway. Someone shook the canary papers out, just growing outside as a weed. The fiber ones and the seed ones do not have much in the way of the THC compounds. I don't think we would have seen a lot of addiction, but anyway, the fiber, you can see there in the middle of the lower part of the screen, was a nice, soft, strong hemp fiber. It actually comes from the stem. See that cross-section of the stem? Everything that's stained blue, those are the fibers. They're right under the skin, right under the epidermis, and they come out, and it's a beautiful, strong fiber, somewhat fireproof. And we needed these fibers because so many of the tropical fibers that we were using were grown in Indonesia, and we could not get our hands on them during the war. And we put hemp in canvas. In fact, that name canvas, the C-A-N, is from cannabis, so it's actually named for cannabis. We used it in parachutes. We used it in parachute cords. Young men bailed out of airplanes, and they were putting all of their strength on those cannabis-containing cords, all the equipment. Farmers who wanted to grow cannabis, hemp in this country, had to go through a lot of paperwork. There was fear that young men would sneak into the fields at night, I'm not, and take it and become addicts indeed. Let's see. I want to talk a little bit about military farms. This is a forgotten bit of history. So American agriculture actually extended into the Pacific region because they wanted the young men to have fresh fruits and vegetables, could not possibly ship tomatoes and corn and lettuce into the South Pacific and have it get there whole and not decomposed. And so, as a way to get around that, the U.S. Army, with the help of the USDA, started hydroponic farms on many of these islands. Now you know that virtually every island in the Pacific is either a coral island or a volcanic island. So the coral islands, it's rough coral. The volcanic islands, it's rough lava. Either way, not really much in the way of soil. And so they took sledgehammers to the substrate, pounded it up into gravel, made beds of gravel, planted the plants in the gravel, and then pumped the hydroponic nutrient solution through the gravel. And then let it seep out by gravity and return, and just kept pumping all day long. And these gardens were unbelievably productive. They had them on Ascension Island, British Guiana, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Wake Island, and several other sites. And I have some figures here. A single hydroponic bed of 120 square feet on Wake Island, every week was yielding 20 heads of lettuce, 30 pounds of tomatoes, and 40 pounds of corn. Yeah. A little more on agriculture. Of course, the one crop that really was the war crop, besides cotton, was soybeans. Now, what about soybeans? Well, look at that poster. Your country needs soybeans for food, feed, and guns. Guns? Well, by the end of the war, we couldn't get walnut anymore for gun stocks. They were actually making gun stocks out of a plastic made from soybeans. It was used to feed animals, used to feed pigs and this sort of thing, and used as a human food. Now, most people did not like the taste or texture of soybeans, and they also seem to cause flatulence. When you cook soybeans, housewives would try to cook them, they don't shed protein and get that nice sort of creamy liquid that like a normal soldier bean or baked bean does. They just stay whole and they just look at you in the pot. And so most women were not real wild about cooking soybeans, but we tried to persuade them that they wanted to. And the head of all soybean cookery in this country was actually at Cornell, Sarah Gibson Blanding. She went on to become the president of Vassar College. She was actually a London-trained economist, and her job was to convince American women that you could make soybean bread, soybean soup, soybean casserole, soybean pudding, and you're going to love it if you make it. And of course, the thing that was great about soybean is that it's a legume. So you see that inside of the roots there. The roots have little spheres on them, and inside those spheres live nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They can literally take atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into protein, and so you don't have to fertilize soybeans. So that was one of the reasons it was such a great crop. You may have heard of Percy Julian, who was an African-American chemist who worked with the Glidden Paint Company in Michigan. He became fascinated with soybeans. He started an entire soya division at Glidden Paint during the war, and he realized that one thing you could do with soybeans was to grind them up, liberate the protein, and it was actually make sort of a viscous mixture, and if you bubbled CO2 through that mixture, those CO2 bubbles would stay in place and stay whole for quite a while. And so an aerosol mist of this sprayed on fuel, naval fuel that got spread across the ocean in some sort of a naval attack would actually put out those fires. This was actually patented. He called it bean soup. That's what the sailors began calling it. It looked like bean soup floating on the sea, but it saved a lot of lives. It was basically a way of getting rid of fire on board a ship, and especially if young men ended up in the water, and the water was burning because there was fuel on it, that those fires could be extinguished with bean soup. And if you're interested in Percy Julian, there's actually an excellent NOAA program about him that you can probably find on PBS. Well, of course, the Germans found out about soybeans and thought that Hitler thought they sounded pretty good because it was basically a meat substitute. You could dry them, they'd last a long time, you could feed people on them, people would stay healthy. It might be a boring diet, but you'd live. And he began calling them Nazi Bohnen, Nazi beans. And he tried to convince the German children to eat them. Articles were written in the Hitler Youth magazine about the Nazi Bohnen. And he considered just trying to feed the entire Wehrmacht on soybeans. This was nothing new. During World War I, they had considered trying to feed the entire German army on Erbsuppe, on pea soup. Rejected the idea. He thought about maybe just feeding them all soybeans. It was just one little glitch. The same way the Germans thought that Germany was only for German people, he also believed that Germany was also only for German plants and that German people should only be fed German plants. Soybeans are from Asia. But he rewrote history and called them Nazi beans. And also developed a new theory, which was that if a plant has been living among the German people for some decades, the plant actually became Germanified. And I thought, since we're talking about the Germans here, that you would just enjoy seeing the list. I'm not going to read you this list. But just look at this list of all of the different German government ministries, committees, organizations involved in some way with growing plants and feeding people. And I'll tell you what a few of the word roots are. Nährstand is nutrition. You can kind of pick out some of these. Ernährung is diet. Volkswirtschaft is economics. Landwirtschaft is agriculture. Huge amount of overlap in the German government. Multiple different officials all trying to do the same thing. And I'm told, I have read, that this was actually part of Hitler's governing technique, to basically set up turf wars among his subsidiary staff and hope that they would fight each other and not him. Basically a lot of duplication of roles. Here in the U.S., we have the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And how did this all turn out in Germany? Since we veered into Germany, we might as well finish the job here, right? So in the upper right there, let me see, you see a child from the Hitler Youth, and of course the equivalent girls organization was the BDM, the Bund der Deutschen Mädchen. And part of the whole mentality in Germany was that the Hitler Youth and the BDM really became the property of your body, became the property of the Fuhrer from the time that you were 10 years old. And that's what the second poster there says. Youth belong to Hitler, to the Fuhrer, from the time you are 10 years old on. And this meant that they worked. They did not necessarily get educated during the war years. They worked. And so you can see that much of agriculture was being done by young women. And things were sufficiently desperate at the end of the war. There was not a well-organized agriculture program. There was not an organized program of gardening at your home to supply your family. So people were literally gardening in the bombed-out ruins. And you can see the Reichstag, now the Bundestag building there in the first illustration. And so things were really enormously desperate in Germany. And that little poster there on the lower right, so the German word to collect and gather is actually the verb hamstern, from which we have taken the word hamster, for the pet hamster. And so that little poster says hamstern. So a hamstern is a female hamster. Shame addict, shame on you. And what is she doing? That is a anthropomorphized hamster. So that's supposed to represent a middle-class woman from the city going out into the countryside to try to collect food for her family. This apparently was going on. Women in the bombed-out ruins of these cities would venture out on foot into the countryside. And the joke was that the farmers' wives ended up with all the fine table linens and the ruby earrings because this is all these women had left to trade. Official German position was this wasn't happening, we don't want you to do it. But honestly, they had very little choice. And so that's what she was doing. Let's see here. The one crop that did grow extremely well in Germany was rye. They did use primarily rye for bread. And I want to spin off from rye and tell you one other thing they did with rye, and that was actually to make boots. So the German troops were extremely unprepared for the Russian winter, despite the Nazi plan to move in and colonize eastern territories. I don't think they really understood the winter climate in Russia, and they did not have adequate footwear. And so they came up with the idea of taking the stems of ryegrass, making them into bundles, lacing the bundles together. Now this is very much, you see I have a skep there, the beehive skep. It's basically the same little homely technology for making a skep. You make a bundle of rye and you coil it. But instead of coiling it into a beehive, they coiled it into boots. And they in fact were waterproof because ryegrass stems have a lot of silica on them. And that's what the little microscopic insect in the lower right shows. So all those little things look like little hamburgers almost. Those are silica deposits. So they're very waterproof. But they tend to attract ice and snow. And so they were terrible to try to walk in. But can you imagine getting through a Russian winter with nothing more than a beehive on either foot? And these were actually made by women at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. That was their job, to bundle this rye and turn it into these subpar boots. Okay, now we'll jump over to England very quickly. And of course, England had a huge gardening program. It was the Dig for Victory program. And their situation was comparatively much more desperate than the situation in the U.S. You know, in the U.S., nobody would have starved. If we didn't have victory gardens, people still would have gotten through the war. There wouldn't have even really been hungry. You might not have had a balanced diet, but you would have eaten. In Germany, there could have been starvation without the Dig for Victory program. And the reason for this is that before the war, in the 1930s, the British were importing about 70% of their food. And once they were at war with Germany, after the Germans invaded Poland, Hitler sent the U-boats over and they completely surrounded the British Isles. And so it was hard to get shipments through. And so the English really were starving. So they mounted the Dig for Victory program. Everybody had at least a garden at home or an allotment somewhere. Everybody was gardening. I like that Yardley commercial on the lower left. Ladies, you know, you might be outside gardening, but you can still smell like lavender. One of the most commonly repeated images during the war was a bomb crater in the middle of the Bayswater Road. That's what you see in the lower right. That was in all the Pathé newsreels. It was in a lot of the newspapers. It was a bomb crater, a German bomb, made a big hole, and a gardener went out to the middle of the road and planted it as a victory garden. They thought it was such an in-your-face message to the Germans that they just copied this over and over. The diet in England was very much dependent upon certain crops during the war. Basically potatoes, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and carrots. And so that's what you see in the basket there on the cover of Wife and Home magazine. The climate in the southern half of England is such that Brussels sprouts, which are basically little miniature cabbages, will grow year-round. And so people just kept those in their yards or in their allotments, and they just go out and get those whenever they wanted. A very typical wartime pie, a wartime dish, was this Lord Woolton pie. The pastry was made of a mixture of flour and potatoes and a little water. And then in sort of a flour sauce, you had whatever root vegetables you happened to have on offer that day. It basically had no taste, but it did feed you. And onions became so sought after during the war that people just hoarded onions whenever they could get one. The problem in England was that they had several failures of the onion crops during the war years. The onions would not dry properly, so you had onions during the time the gardens were growing, but in the dead of winter, the onions just did not dry, they just decomposed. So people had a very boring diet, but they did in fact get through it. The government took a very positive and overstated position on carrots. And this probably stemmed from the blackouts, because the cities were being bombed, and so all the lights had to go out at night. The headlights had to be painted over in black, have little shades put on them. Everybody's walking around in the dark. There were literally thousands of civilian casualties in the first couple of months on the roads because people were getting mowed down by motor vehicles. And so the government put out a huge amount of pro-carrot propaganda, implying that the more carrots you eat, the better and better your eyesight would become. Now, we know that there is an upward limit to how good your eyesight can become, no matter how much carrot you eat. So the deal with carrots chemically is that carrots contain the orange pigment carotene, and each carotene is actually 2 vitamin A's. So you eat carotene and you're getting this big dose of vitamin A. Each carotene gives you 2 vitamin A's. And it will improve night blindness to some extent. We actually loaned them some Disney artists for some of their wartime propaganda. So that little Dr. Carrot was actually drawn by a Disney artist that we loaned them. And those little children in the lower right, they are actually eating carrots. Now, so look at the size of those carrots. I can guarantee you there's wood in those carrots. Those little tykes are eating. So they would take the carrot and actually dip it in toffee, which would harden. They would impale it on a stick and convince the children it was better than ice cream. Do those children resent that to this day? I don't know. Much of the farming in England was extremely organized, and it was done by women and girls. They had a land army. Women were actually conscripted in England. You had to do some kind of work. If you did not have young children, and if you were married or unmarried or a war widow, if you did not have young children, you had to work. And one of the jobs that you could do would be to join the land army. And these women went out and they reclaimed ancient farmlands that were flooded, abandoned, they had become highly acidic. Many of them were covered but with heather, which is that purple flowered plant there. Heather tends to kill other plants that are growing near it, so the heather had to be removed and all the soil broken up. And they dragged a device known as the mole subsoiler. That's in the lower right. It's basically an iron hook that goes down in the ground. You drag this thing through the soil, and it breaks up any hard pan, and it breaks up soil that had been farmed since the ancient Romans and earlier. And so this is how much of the formal farming was done in England during the war. And where did the women actually learn how to do this? They, in fact, were trained. England had had a long tradition of agricultural training for young women. And much of this was started by a woman named Daisy Greville, who was the Countess of Warwick. And you see her there on the right, painted by John Singer Sargent. And I like to think of her as a socialite who became a socialist. And in 1903, she started the Studley College Horticultural School. And it was a place for young women, basically the Lady Edith Crawleys of the world, to learn, you know her, she, right, second daughter in Downton Abbey. Didn't know quite what Edith was going to do. She could have gone to this school. To learn farming, market gardening, colonial life, beekeeping, bookkeeping, and other skills that would be useful to lady farmers, especially if you wanted to go and become a colonial farmer in, say, Australia or Canada. And so these schools, Studley and others, is where the girls learned these skills, and they really knew what they were doing, and that is how much of the farming went on in England during the war. Back on the home front, bombing of British cities meant that there was need for sheltering. And if you had a garden, the government would bring to you an Anderson shelter, disassembled. It arrived as 14 corrugated metal sheets. You had to dig down several feet, about 3 or 4 feet. Assemble the 14 corrugated sheets. So far, so good. And then take shovels full of soil that you excavated, put them on top of the shelter, and here's the important part, pound them down, because that was what actually gave the protection against flying shrapnel. This would not help you in the case of a direct hit, but flying shrapnel would be stopped by this impacted soil on the top of the Anderson shelter. And you had to have about 15 inches of really dense soil. Of course, then the British realized that German bombers from the sky looking down are going to see these patches of naked soil and realize that there are British civilians in there and drop the bombs. So what to do? The only thing was garden camouflage, and they began growing squash. Those giant squash in the lower left, they call them marrows over there. It's like a big bloated yellow squash, big, and they grow very fast. And most people grew those. Some people also grew any sort of a binding plant. That's a reconstructed Anderson there on the lower right. But this is how many people got through the war, spending their nights in these Anderson shelters. This was all hard on women. And there were a lot of different medicines, over-the-counter proprietary mixtures that were sold. This was one, Wincarnis tonic wine. Has all these herbs in it, but notice also 17% alcohol. That was no ordinary wine. It was closer to hard liquor. I think they called it a fortified medicinal wine, but look at her note right there. The war, it really must have been very, very bad. And I'm sure plenty of women hit the Wincarnis during the war. But more common, I think, were various over-the-counter tablets. And there was an entire industry of these nerve tablets that people had and used, women especially used. That photo on the top, if you've seen the movie Mrs. Miniver with Greer Garson and Walter Pidgeon, and there is an extremely graphic scene in there where they're in the Anderson shelter at night. The only difference would be women. It would be just like this, except you wouldn't have Walter Pidgeon with you, right? You would have mom and children and maybe grandmother and grandfather Anyway, these pills, most of them contained an herb, which is valerian, which actually contains compounds called the valproates, which are now known actually to calm nerves. This was used during World War I for cases of shell shock as well. And so it's been a useful wartime plant. And while we're talking about medicines in England, I want to say something about what happened with the medicine supply in England during the war. Vast majority of pharmaceutical drugs that were going to England before the war came from Holland. The big pharmaceutical houses were in Amsterdam. And the usual story here, same with the seeds. Once the Germans settled in Amsterdam, they were not sending pharmaceutical drugs to England. And so the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew worked with the War Department, the Ministry of War, and came up with the Vegetable Drugs Plan and the County Herb Committee scheme. It's also British. And basically published pamphlets, guidebooks that told you county by county which medicinal plants could be gathered and when, and how to collect them and how to dry them. And this shows you just a few of the plants that they actually were collecting in England and using as a substitute for medicinal plants from Europe during the war. So up the right there, rose hips, big source of vitamin C. In the middle, foxglove, that was used to regulate heartbeat for cases of heart failure, congestive heart disease. Sphagnum moss in the upper right, that is a moss that is so acidic that it's sterile, and it actually can be used for sterile bandages. Going around clockwise, below it is red algae from the coast, and that was used for agar and also as a source of iodine and vitamins. In the middle of the bottom there, that's a nightshade, and that was used for tropane alkaloids that reduce pain. And then over in the lower left, that's horse chestnut, and that was used as a source of simple sugars that we used to make different agars and also to treat diabetes. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There were literally dozens and dozens of plants that were collected as medicinal plants during World War II and sent to drug companies in England to actually make up into pharmaceutical drugs. I don't want to suggest that they actually were using these herbally themselves. They were being used really to make pharmaceutical drugs. And then the Ministry of Food realized, well, heck, we've got these wonderful hedgerows. Why don't we go out and get people to actually collect food from the hedgerows? So this was another scheme they had in England, was the hedgerow harvest. And they were out there not only collecting drug plants from many of the hedgerows, but also collecting all kinds of wild fruits. So sloes, which are like little plums, and berries, and cherries, and brambles, which are blackberries and raspberries, all sorts of edible fruit could be collected from these hedgerows, which are basically hedges between agricultural fields. The women's institutes were taking these, preserving them into jams, and not keeping them or selling them themselves, but just putting them into the national food supply. And this is my last slide related to England, but I just thought I'd pop it in here. This shows you what happened in England after the bombing stopped, when the cities regenerated botanically. A tremendous number of plants just sprouted in all of the bombing rubble across England. And no one really was expecting this or even knew what it was. Some people thought that some of the plants had actually been brought in by the bombers. But no, the seeds were simply in the soil, some of them dating probably back thousands of years. And it's interesting to me as a botanist how many of these plants actually were medicinal. So for instance, in the upper right there, that's coltsfoot. Coltsfoot is the plant they used to carve into signs in pre-literate England to indicate that this was an herb shop. Same way they would carve a barber pole or a gold tooth to denote a barber or a dentist. They would carve foot flower to show this was an herb shop. Chamomile, upper left there, something actually grows in New Hampshire, is fireweed. Also, all of these have medicinal uses, and they sprouted all over in the rubble and stayed there until they rebuilt the cities. That's my last picture. Okay, now. I'm looking to see if I've spoken too long. I've got to speed up here a little bit. I'm just going to do a little hop, skip, and a jump here. I want to say a little bit about Germany. We talked a little bit about German agriculture. One eye-opener for me was what happened with German medicine during the war, and the fact that Hitler And some of his underlings, including Heinrich Himmler, had an obsession with herbs, many of which actually were British, but had a fixation with traditional herbal medicine. Heinrich Himmler actually led the Schutzstaffel into a big herb project at the Dachau concentration camp. And that's what you see there, are the herb gardens and greenhouses at the Dachau concentration camp, where they carried on not only cultivation of the herbs, but composting, vermiculture, growing plants in company with earthworms. They used slave labor, much of it Jewish slave labor, to cultivate all of these medicinal plants. The slaves worked without, or prisoners, I should say, worked without equipment to drain much of this soil, to dredge these wetlands and get them prepared to grow herbs. And all in all, they grew about 40 acres of traditional herbs. And this was all in conjunction with an idea of rejecting modern medicine. Hitler's idea was that German people would simply use German herbs. And again, it was the same problem. Most of these herbs actually were from the Mediterranean or other European countries. They were not really German, but I guess they became Germanified over time. And I might add that one of the reasons for rejecting medicine was that many of the medical doctors were Jewish. And so they wanted to sort of separate people from dependency upon Jewish doctors. Single most important medicinal plant during the war, both in Germany and in the US, I think in any country really, would be opium poppy. Because of the pain that it alleviates. Opium contains a couple of dozen different alkaloids, one of which is morphine. And morphine during World War II, both we did this, the British did it, the Germans did it, was actually pre-measured into little syrettes so that this could be administered immediately on the battlefield, not an overdose, just enough to relieve pain. Things became so desperate in Germany that they were actually asking civilians to grow opium poppies in the bombed out rubble that you saw in that agriculture slide. The Germans had one particularly unique use for opium, and it was a drug called Scofidol, Zay, that was made by Merck. And it included scopolamine, which comes from black nightshade over on the left, or any of its relatives. It was also used as a truth serum. Ephedrine, which is in the middle, and oxycodone, which is a morphine derivative. So this was administered to men who were badly injured on the battlefield. What did it do? Scopolamine made you forget that you'd been injured, so you wouldn't be afraid to go back out there again. Ephedrine tightened the blood vessels so that you didn't bleed out, and the oxycodone, basically the morphine, alleviated the pain. And this was administered to Germans. I don't think we had anything comparable to it, because the idea was that they were going to heal and then go back out there and fight some more. A very similar mixture was used in Germany for something known as twilight sleep. And this was actually developed before the war, after World War I and before World War II, as a way to increase the size of the German population. It was developed in Freiburg by Gauss and Koenig, who were two medical doctors. No ephedrine, but it was the scopolamine and again the opioid, the morphine. And the idea was that a woman would be dosed with this mixture during labor, which can be painful, and she would forget the pains of childbirth and be willing to keep having little children. And this became popular in the U.S. as well, and was used in the U.S. Through the 1960s, twilight sleep. The German women during the Third Reich had to attend, if they were married, had to attend a Reich's bride school. You didn't just go and get married, you were trained to be a wife. And the lessons included horse child rearing, food preparation, gardening to some extent, and all of this German herbalism. And can you see that little inset in the lower right there? The ideal German wife with her family, and it's a sizable family, probably all born with twilight sleep, And she is completely surrounded by herbal plants, and she's using those to raise her family. I want to say just 2 words about some other medical challenges here. For us, the big issue in the South Pacific was malaria. And we ran out of quinine very quickly because quinine comes from feverbark, and all the feverbark trees were being raised in Indonesia on islands that were occupied by the Japanese. And we tried to figure out a way to go down into Central and South America and bring back feverbark trees and grow them, but the problem is they're trees and there was a war and you have to do it quickly. What finally happened with quinine was that we just didn't use much of it during the war. And there was a drug called abagrine that was the substitute. And then by the end of the war, it was actually synthesized by Robert Woodward. And his funding actually came from the Polaroid Corporation. You know, the Polaroid land camera. Dr. Land said, Bob, why don't you go and work on quinine until that gets worked out? And he funded it. But that was really the biggest scourge we had in the South Pacific. Another big medical challenge was infection. And penicillin was known at the time of the war. But the British, who first discovered it in modern times, were having trouble growing it. So they sent penicillin to the U.S. It ended up at the University of Illinois in Chicago Circle. Microbiologists took one look at it there and said, let's grow it in corn liquor. Take cornmeal, boil it in water, filter it, get that liquid, and penicillin, you could grow batches of it. So those big tanks are filled with penicillin. It was in all the newsreels. Those guys in Chicago went to a local grocery store. They found a moldy melon that was teeming with penicillin mold. They brought it back and they grew tons and tons of penicillin from that. And they were getting ready to start shipping it into the theater of war when the Coconut Grove fire occurred in Boston. That was on November 28, 1942. The Coconut Grove was a big nightclub, and it was decorated to look like the South Pacific. I don't think that was a coincidence. It was the night of the Holy Cross BC game, football game. A lot of people were there celebrating. I think BC won. Someone changed a light bulb. There was a spark. Absolutely terrible fire. About 500 people died. Hundreds of people were sent to 3 different area hospitals. They requested penicillin. They hadn't even purified the penicillin. They just literally sent in the tanks of penicillin, which had in it the mold, the liquid, the dirt, and they just hooked those up to these people intravenously, and they saved many lives, kept them from ending up with staphylococcus infections that they lost mostly their skin. And that was the first time that penicillin was used, not in the theater of war. But the idea was that it would help prevent people from having to lose limbs due to infection if penicillin could stop the infection. But here's something they did not tell the wives and mothers, that actually much of the penicillin was used for venereal diseases. And look at that skull there wearing the Cattleya orchid. It was very scary. And of course, many young men did interact with women who were carrying gonorrhea or syphilis. Syphilis was relatively attractive. I think it took about a week to get rid of it with penicillin. Gonorrhea could be cured overnight. Previous to penicillin, the treatment actually was a mercury-based compound. And the men were given those little packets there, and a little tube, and this mercury-based compound. And you can take it from there, you know, I won't talk about it. 2 words about wood. A lot of wood was used during the war for all of these things. And a lot of that wood actually came from New Hampshire, because the 1938 hurricane knocked down tens of thousands of trees, and there was the foresight to take those trees and store them as intact logs in New Hampshire lakes, where a combination of the cold temperatures and the tannins in the water, the naturally occurring tannins from all the pines and the hemlocks, preserved all of that lumber until it was needed. And then the War Department was able to fish out those logs, cut them up into board feet, and build a lot of the barracks that were needed, and a lot of the airplane hangars were made from logs that had spent several years in New Hampshire lakes. Now sometimes in botany, I'm a botanist, people don't know why in the world you're studying the things you're studying. Like, why would you ever want to know something about some tree in the South Pacific? what a waste of time. Not that I'm bitter about this. How many times have people said, why would you want to know that? And then a war comes along, and all of a sudden you have to build piers, and you have to build all sorts of buildings, and Quonset huts, and all sorts of stuff down in some Pacific region, and it suddenly becomes very useful to know something about wood anatomy and how different woods are used, and which ones are good for building, and which ones you can build a pier on. The U.S. Army found out very quickly that there were certain woods, if you built a pier going out in the water, that different worms came out of the sea and ate the pier within 2 months. And so all of a sudden, botanical knowledge became very useful. A couple of the most bizarre uses of wood during the war. This is Project Habakkuk, which was a joint project between Churchill, Mountbatten, and the man in the upper right there, who was Dr. Hermann Mark. He was formerly the head of chemistry at the Kaiser-Wilhelm Institute. If you stay for the Q&A, someone asked me how Dr. Mark got out of Germany and ended up working on Project Habakkuk. But anyway, the idea was to make a landing craft that could be used in the North Atlantic for airplanes that needed to refuel, but not out of metal, but out of ice, a big ice platform. But ice alone wouldn't work. You had to have something in there to stabilize the ice. And it turned out that cellulose from wood. And Dr. Mark was a well-known polymer chemistry. He knew all about what happens when you mix cellulose with water and freeze it. And they worked on this. The idea was to make, they did in fact make a scale model, and by the time they got ready to build the whole thing, the war was basically over, and the airplanes had large enough tanks that they did not need to refuel. Also, Roosevelt thought it was nuts. That's another story. But it honestly, I think it would have worked. And it was basically a huge ice cube with sawdust in it, is what it boiled down to. Another use of wood was to make paper. One of the most interesting sorts of paper was made out of a mulberry that grew in Japan. And this is the paper that was used to make balloons that floated bombs over to the U.S. How many of you know that we were extensively bombed by the Japanese during the war? And those bombs got here with these paper balloons made from the leaves of the paper mulberry. In Japan, girls' schools actually assembled these balloons. The girls abandoned academic work. They glued the big sections of these bombs together, assembled them, they tested them, whether they would hold air. They attached incendiaries to them and floated them across the Pacific. There was only one case of death. It was a Sunday school picnic. You can see the news story there in the inset. It was the children and the wife of the minister. One of the little children found the balloon. What is this? He touched it and the incendiaries went off. But these bombs ended up on the western side of the U.S. And I think there are still plenty of them out there. In other words, if you're out west and you see something in the soil and you don't know what it, don't touch it. No, seriously, these are still out there. There are remnants of the war. The one reason that more of these bombs did not reach us was that the Japanese schoolgirls were starving. And the glue they used was actually edible. And it was much like poi, almost like a wallpaper paste. It was made from the dragon lily in the lower left of the illustration. And of course the idea was to set forest fires to distract us, that we'd all have to go up to the Pacific Northwest and fight forest fires. It didn't do that, but it did cause some confusion. The American people, by and large, were not told about this. The explosion that killed the Sunday school group was more or less kept secret. It was of unknown origin. They did not want to upset and demoralize the Americans. Project Gimmick. This is just recently released from the CIA. There were actually little prototypes made of wooden submarines, and they were made as prototypes for a fleet of little 1- or 2-person submarines that would be used in the event it was necessary to invade the Japanese home islands. And some of these got loose in the ocean and were washing up on the coast. And I remember one washed up, actually I was in graduate school at the time, and some people thought it was a Japanese one. CIA really wasn't saying what it was, but this is what they looked. And couple of them are on display down, I think, at Fall River. Tiny little wooden sub. I'll mention briefly two aspects of warfare that were very much impacted by vegetation. The bocage warfare in Normandy. This was after D-Day. The tanks got into Normandy, and they encountered these enormous hedgerows. The hedgerows in England were hedges. The hedgerows in Normandy were mountains topped with hedges. After hundreds or maybe thousands of years of plowing, each one of the agricultural fields was surrounded by a berm of soil. The tanks had to go up and over these berms. The Germans got there first. They already had dug into the sides of these berms. That's a cross section there in the lower left. So they had snipers just waiting for those tanks to come up. The relatively unarmored underbelly of the tank now being vertical, and they would shoot in where the men were. They knew how to do this. It was so difficult to maneuver in these that they had to assign one man in the tank as navigator. Because you're looking down at it from the sky. It was literally thousands of green squares. And you get into one of these, and everywhere you went just looked the same. You just see this wall. And the tanks were not designed to go through them, and they were not designed to go over them because the bottom of the tank was unarmored. And finally, they realized that you could attach some metal pieces to the tank. So you see the tank in the lower right there. That's what they call it, the rhino tank. And they took some of the big metal deterrents, the anti-landing craft stuff that was on the beaches, and they took those, cut them, and soldered them on the tank so that the tank had a fighting chance of actually going through the dense thing of roots and actually cutting through the berm. But it was bad. And another time that vegetation was important in warfare was certainly in the Hürtgen forest, where the Germans really knew how to weaponize the trees and turn the trees themselves into weapons. So the Germans really are expert wood anatomists, and they knew enough about conifer wood and man-made Hürtgen forest to know exactly where to explode the bombs in the sky so the trees just flew apart into daggers. And men were impaled by this fine wood and quickly learned to do not lie down on the ground, which is the conventional wisdom in a bombing attack, but to lean into the tree, plaster yourself against the surface, make yourself as small as possible, minimum surface area exposure, so that you wouldn't be pierced by the wood.
Judith?
Yeah, I think I have to stop. Yeah.
We're
Okay, yeah, we're done. Yeah. The Germans loved oaks, and see that swastika there? Just when you think everything about World War II was known, that appeared not that many years ago from the sky. And those were planted, a few of them in Bavaria, with tamarack trees. And they appear in the fall when the trees turn yellow. And as soon as they appeared, they went in and removed enough of the trees that you couldn't see it anymore. But that was something that was probably planned and planted during the war and then had to be removed. And of course you see a lot of vegetation in their metals and different commemorative stuff. Okay, this is actually the last slide here. Camouflage. You have to know a lot about botany to be good at camouflage, that's all I'll say. A lot of botanists got called in to work on camouflage. And remember I said kudzu was very important in camouflage. And the thing about kudzu is that it's also edible. And it was actually, although it became a bit of a pest in the South Pacific, it was actually a big survival and emergency food, both in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the war, in those bombed-down cities. So listen, that is the end of the talk. Some people might want to run to the door and get out.
Judith, will you also tell them, I know you're coming back to Wolfboro in September, would you tell them about that?
I'm coming back to Wolfboro to talk to the Garden Club, and we have two representatives from the Garden Club here, raise your hands. And talk about a very different and non-combative, non-military topic. I'm going to talk about the botany of birds' nests and what plant materials birds actually use in nest building and why. A lot of chemistry.